Normally to prove that something exists, we use one, if not a combination of our 5 senses. Can we see it? Can we hear it? Can we smell it? Can we touch it? And can we taste it? Okay? And for most of us, we haven't experienced any of those senses of God. Some people have claimed to see Him. Clearly people in the Bible had seen Him or had a glimpse of Him. Couldn't really see Him face to face. Some people have heard His audible voice. But for the most of us who believe, we haven't actually experienced God with our 5 senses. So I was going to do a little bit of an experiment quick. I need 2 volunteers. Scott, you're sitting right in front, you can help this one. I want you to create a human out of this.
I'm hopeless at this. Give me a chance.
And pick on somebody young. Abs. I think you're the youngest, yeah? Close. No, I think it's shape. Anyway, Abs, you can come up. Okay, so I want you to write your name and draw a picture of yourself. Was that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles? Thanks, Babs. Okay, thank you. I just put it down there. Okay, so we've got 2 exhibits. We've got exhibits A, Exhibit Abby, and exhibits B. What is it, Scott? Okay, now have any of you mascot? Have any of you seen either Scott's brain or Abby's brain?
No.
Have you smelt it? Have you tasted it? Have you heard it?
No.
Have you touched it?
No.
Well, maybe Nate stuck his finger in his ear at some point in that. Okay, so none of us have actually ever seen, with any of our senses, experienced Abby's brain or Scott's brain. But do we believe that they have one?
Yeah.
It's not a trick question. Yes. Well, at least one out of 2 is not bad, right? Yeah, so we clearly believe they have one because there's evidence that they've got a brain, okay? Clearly there's evidence because they've created things, they can do things. We can experience language, drawing, art, well, I think we call it art, abstract art. But there's evidence that they have a brain, and none of us here would doubt that. So when it comes to trying to explain to somebody, you can't explain God exists because you haven't experienced it with any of your 5 senses, we can say there's clear evidence that God exists. And I love this first slide I want to show you guys. Because for me it encapsulates the evidence of the Creator God that we have. There's the universe, and those of us who are privileged enough to go up to Golden Harvest, not last Friday, the Friday before, Mike Muller just scratched the surface on how huge and enormous our universe is and the precise mechanics for it to actually exist. Even the concept of gravity, that 2 bodies are actually drawn towards each other. It's a mystery to the scientists. Why does that actually happen? Well, it has to happen for the universe to exist. So God had to have created it. Without it, this whole universe would spin out of control. There wouldn't be this cohesive glue, this unseen glue that keeps the whole universe together. And the precision for that to happen is so precise, it's beyond any precise instrument that us as humans have ever created. Many more times more accurate to keep that whole universe. And that's just our galaxy with a whole lot of stars. And there are thousands and millions of galaxies. It's just mind-blowing, the universe itself. And then when you get down to one of the smallest details of creation is the DNA. And you can see there's like a small portion of it there. A DNA is actually like a language. it illustrates intelligent design. It can only be created, can only be designed. DNA is the most compact form of storing information known to man. You know, you get this little memory stick and you can't believe how much you can store in it now. We used to have those floppy disks and we tossed those long ago because we can store so much in a little memory stick. DNA can take thousands, hundreds of thousands of memory stick and pop it on the top of a pin and store more information than all of those memory sticks put together. It's the most compact form of information. You can take the tiniest little hair, cut a small piece of it, and it contains your entire makeup. It's incredible, the language inside DNA. And then even for me, the human hand, it's the most amazing part for me of creation of the human body. Obviously, the whole human body is fascinating, but to have something which can punch through a wall 1 second, caress a baby's cheek in another, write a sentence in another instant. People, engineers in robotics have tried to recreate the human hand many, many times over. They're getting there slowly, but nowhere near the precision and accuracy that our human hands can do. And that started from something this small, and it just created. There has to be an intelligent designer. And most people who do not believe in our God will believe that the universe and the world displays that there has to be an intelligent designer behind what we see and what we experience on a daily basis. And so, to actually prove that there has to be a higher being, that there has to be something bigger than what we are, to create what we are, and to create what we see all around us, that's actually not too difficult to explain. And a lot of people will believe that there is a higher being. The trick though, well not the trick, but sometimes the tricky thing, is how do we explain that it's the God of the Bible that we believe is this supreme being? And so you can see the first part of Genesis in the top right-hand corner, in the beginning. And we started in the beginning in the series with Jeremy explaining, and he covered a whole lot of the concepts with regards to creation versus evolution. And then Craig picked up last week, and we looked at the importance of understanding the biblical account of Genesis. Now the problem is that we often tell these accounts as if they were stories. So we don't hear about the account of Noah's Ark, we hear about the story of Noah's Ark. And so we end up with something like this. Okay? So here's my Noah's Ark. And this was quite a favorite toy in our house. And you open it up and there's animals. Yeah. And there's Noah and Mrs. Noah, because Noah's wife doesn't have a name, does she? So that is the problem, is that's where we start. And that's where most people perceive Noah's Ark to be. So they believe it's just a story. Because how can it be true if that's what Noah's Ark looked like? But if we actually take the biblical account of Noah's Ark, this is more what it would look like. And if we start reading in Genesis, and we are now in chapter 6, I want to read from the very beginning because there's quite a lot of scripture to go through. And it talks about there was wickedness in the land, and Noah pleased God, and he was a man of upright standing. And then reading from verse 13, it said, "And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and outside with pitch. And this is how you shall make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. I want to stop there at that point, actually, because if we had to look at the dimensions of the ark, so I thought I had put this in my notes here, but obviously I've mixed my slides up. If I remember correctly, I think it's 130 meters long, 50 meters wide, and 30 meters high. Okay, so that's 1.5 football pitches long. That's the length of the ark, and then you can probably guess the width is probably similar, and the height is 30. Now, they've actually done studies on all the ocean-going vessels that they've created, which not for speed, but designed to carry goods. And the dimensions are almost identical. The perfect dimensions are identical to what the dimensions of the ark were given to know. How would he have known that? To build an ocean-going vessel of those precise dimensions. Then he says, and you shall finish it to a cubit from above, and set the door of the ark in its side. You shall make it with lower, second, and third decks, and behold, I myself am bringing floodwaters on the earth, to destroy from heaven and all flesh in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on earth shall die. And so he gives Noah these dimensions. Now, a lot of people have come up with different theories. Was it actually a box, or did it have curved sides? And we don't actually know exactly. Often, if you say that I'm 6 foot, I don't say that I'm 6 foot and I'm, 10 inches wide or 50 inches wide or whatever. You just say you're this long, this wide. It doesn't actually give you exactly the curvature of what the ark looked like. So people will take this and give you different pictures of what they perceive the ark should look like. And asked ChatGPT, and they gave me this. Now, it looks quite realistic because there's clouds brewing and there's light in the distance and there's massive big structure going on. But what's wrong with this one? The door is not inside. Okay? So obviously ChatGPT didn't read Genesis 6 too well when it did this. So the door clearly was on the side. So that's one thing that was very clear here. The door was clearly in the side. I actually asked ChatGPT or even Meta AI to give me some images as well of Noah. And this is what he gave me. And even those are wrong. This looks like the guy's building it in the back street of his house in USA somewhere. And what's the problem with the other image? It's already raining.
Yeah.
Okay. So I left AI and I just went to classic old drawings from yesteryear. And this is probably what was going on in building the ark. Now I know it took 120 years to build this. You can imagine he needed that time because they had very rudimentary equipment. Some people reckon they were fairly advanced, so they could even have cranes and different pulley systems to be able to get that timber up there. Because if you think about it, this thing's 30 meters high and you're getting beams up there like this. And there are only 8 people building it. Well, actually 4. Noah and his 3 sons. I don't think the wives, maybe they helped. I mean, in this picture, one of the wives are helping, so I shouldn't be sexist at this point. But yeah, they wouldn't have done many of the heavy lifting, but they needed to get this timber up there. And so these are often the pictures that one conjures up. And so he spent 120 years building this construction. And so you have a classic picture like that. I quite like this one because the one thing we forget is like they had to get all this food together as well. Can you imagine what that must have been like? To get all this food for these animals together. So that must have been a massive job in itself, which we didn't actually think about. Now there have been a couple of people ambitious enough to try and rebuild the ark in today's times. Here's one guy, I forget his name, he's actually a Dutch guy. And he built replicas, not exactly to the same size, but he gives tours on it and gives an kind of experience of what it really is, gives some idea what it's like. But then Answers in Genesis, which is an organization in the USA, Ken Ham and the boys, they actually built to scale, to the exact dimensions that I mentioned earlier, a real-life replica of the ark. And you can go visit it. I think it opened in 2021. they spent 2 years building this. And there's actually a debate whether to show it or not, but I didn't want to get sidetracked. There's like a 2-minute full montage of them building this thing. And you should see the equipment that they had. These massive big cranes and obviously trucks bringing the timber. And it took a massive crew 2 years with all that modern equipment to build a replica of the ark. So you can imagine that Noah definitely needed 120 years to reproduce the same. And they actually, Onsen Genesis came up with this picture, quite different, of what the building of the ark looked like. Because they reckon, because God created man's intelligence, we often think that guys back then were dumb, because you think of, cavemen, but that's evolutionary thinking.
Yeah.
They were built with intelligence. These guys could build things. So if you could build an ark, surely you could build a crane to help build the ark. So they've come into a bit of flack by presenting an image like this, but this could very be what it looked like when Noah and his family were building the ark. And even with they obviously had little boats in those days. And apparently the Hebrew name used was a Tyra. Sounds like my name. And they used the same name for that little ark that Moses stayed in the Nile. When Pharaoh's daughter put him in that little basket. And obviously that was made to float. And it was made to be able to go through the water. And so it potentially did have rounded sides. Who knows? But obviously God knew to communicate with Noah the best vessel for the job. Anyway, so that's potentially what it looked like. So 120 years, the job was done. If we carry on with our story, so I lost my place, so what did I get? Okay. 18. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall go into the ark, you, your sons, and your wife, and your sons' wives with you, and every living thing of all flesh. And you shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark, to keep them alive with you, and they shall be male and female, of bird after their kind, of animals after their kind, and of every creeping thing of the earth after its kind. 2 of every kind come to you to keep them alive. And you shall take for yourself of all the food that is eaten, and you shall gather it to yourself, and it shall be food for you and for them. Thus Noah did according to all that God had commanded him, and so he did. That was the end of Genesis 6. So that then conjures up these images, right? Okay? This was a cartoon drawn and said the first queue ever formed. Okay? And there's always somebody monkeying around in that queue, if you've been at school. And so we have this image of these animals queuing up to go into the ark. And that queue goes on for forever. First of all, we have no idea how Noah and his family kept control. But also, how on earth did they all fit on the ark? Then if we are 6-day creationists, believe in a 6-day creation, we also have this to contend with. Don't we?
Yeah.
Okay? So you think, no, that's a stretch too far. Surely not. Like dinosaurs on the ark as well? Well, if we believe in 6-day creation, and there's definitely accounts of dinosaurs in the Bible, the places where it talks of, remind me of the name of the Behemoth and Leviathan, they could have been none other than a dinosaur. And so they definitely did roam the earth with us. But the thing is, when we think of dinosaurs, what do we think of? Big. Okay? We think of these big guys, the plesiosaurs, and I'm not actually into my dinosaurs, but those really big guys. Now, because they're reptiles, they just continue to grow indefinitely. They keep on growing. And they don't reach adult size, they just keep on growing. And so clearly, they wouldn't have taken the big boys, they would have taken youngsters. And did you know, or guess, what do you think the average size of a dinosaur was?
A sheep.
Yeah, a dog with sheep. Many of the dinosaurs are actually the size of chickens running around. We always think dinosaurs are these massive, big creatures. And so, the dinosaurs, that went into the ark, they would have obviously had youngsters, and that goes across the animal kingdom. They would have taken youngsters on board because they would have taken up less space, they would have eaten less, they wouldn't have got attitude yet. Okay? No, but they would have taken young animals, or God would have brought young animals to the ark. And also it's this concept that they brought them after their kind. Now, kind is a very important word to take cognizance of when we're looking at Noah's Ark, because often we think kind is the same as species, but kind is a broader grouping of a particular type of animal. So if we think of the dog kind, okay, all dog breeds, and this is not even a biblical account. I didn't get this from a biblical website. This is just how they believe that all our species of dogs have arrived. So it starts with the grey wolf, and through selective breeding, effectively, you end up with all of these different animal kinds. It's actually a great disproof of evolution, because often they will equate that we get different types of dogs to dogs evolving. Now, evolution claims that you're adding information to get something more complex. You have to, because how do you get from amoeba to a human? That's the only way evolution can work, is if life forms become more complex and you add more information to it. However, to get your species of dogs, it's actually less information. So the wolf, for example, had all the information for the various different genetics of all different animal types, and obviously just when they get down to Chihuahua, it just ends up breeding with the smaller, and eventually get the little guy. And on that end of the scale, you have the Great Dane. And so, how many dogs did they have on the ark? Two. You know, so when you start to look at kind, it's the same with horses. You know, we have so many different species of horses, but they all form a certain kind, like the donkey, the horse, even the zebra is a type of horse. So anything effectively that can breed with something else is a kind. And some clever mathematicians got together and they established all the different kinds that you have, their average sizes, what the dimensions of the ark would basically then entail as far as the interior size of the actual ark. I think it was the equivalent to 450 containers, or semi-trucks, they said, with American side. So if you think that's how much space was inside the ark that you could fit in 450 trucks, okay? And so by doing all this computation with regard to different kinds that we have, including the dinosaur kinds, they actually worked out that there was sufficient space on the ark for all of those animals, plus their food, and a bit of breathing room as well. And so, statistically and mathematically, the ark could exist. And that's great, because if it couldn't, then we'd have a problem. But when you get into the detail of it, it clearly could exist. And so we have this picture now of all of these animals getting onto the ark. And so if we carry on with our story in Genesis chapter 7, it says, "Then the Lord said to Noah, 'Come into the ark, and you and all your household, because I've seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. You shall take with you 7 of every clean animal, a male and his female, to each of the animals that are unclean, a male and his female.'" So these are obviously the animals. Correct me if I'm wrong here, Scott. Was it for them to be able to eat? Or what? The reason for the 7 that they brought on?
Sacrifices.
Oh, sacrifices, sorry, okay. So these 7 animals, because they're clean, unclean, were for sacrifices. And often people say, well, were there 2 or were there 7 or were there 14? But these animals in particular were for use for sacrifices. It's actually only after Noah's flood were we then commissioned to eat meat. Interestingly enough, before this time, it had never ever rained. Okay? It talks about there was a firmament over the earth. So it's like a dense atmosphere, that there was moisture within the atmosphere. And apparently they've tried to recreate firmament, and they've done so fairly successfully in a lab. What they do, I'm not 100% sure. But they say it's amazing what happens within that firmament. Stuff just grows unbelievably. And even poisonous snakes start to lose their venom. I believe it. And also within that firmament, there's less toll on one's body. The toll of gravity and all of other things. It doesn't have as much of a toll on one's body, and that's why they believe that those guys could live so long, because they lived within this firmament. And so that was even more bizarre for Noah building his ark, because it had never rained, and he wasn't building it near water. So that's why he got mocked for 120 years. Why on earth are you building a boat? How on earth is this water going to get you? Now the water's over there, and you're building it here. And so he faced a lot of opposition. He did what he was told. And after 7 more days, I will cause it to rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. And it will destroy from the face of the earth all living things that I've made. And Noah did according to all that the Lord commanded him. Noah was 600 years old when the flood waters were on the earth. So Noah, with his sons, his wife and his sons' wives, went into the ark because of the waters of the flood, of clean animals, of animals that are unclean, of birds, and of everything that creeps on the earth. 2 by 2 they went into the ark to Noah, male and female, as God had commanded Noah. And it came to pass on 7 days that the waters of the flood were on the earth. And in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, and the rain was on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights.
Wow.
Now, this picture here, before I move on, I don't know if you've spotted something on this ark which probably wasn't on the original ark we know of, definitely not. The cross. Okay? But the reason why I kept this picture, I thought it wasn't really biblically accurate, but in some sense it is biblically accurate. Because what does the ark represent? It's a representation of salvation. There was only one door. Jesus is the only door to salvation. And so the ark, just as important that we understand as a historical account, it's the most beautiful picture of our salvation. There's only one way to God, and that is through Jesus. There was only one way to survive the flood. There's only one way to survive God's judgment, and that is in Jesus. And there was only way for them to physically survive was to be in the ark, just like we need to be in Christ. And so I quite enjoy that picture. But the one thing that's wrong with this picture, maybe the storm clouds were just gathering, but I don't know if you took cognizance of the words that were written there. It said the fountains of the deep burst forth. Because some people say, like, how long did it really have to rain to flood the entire surface of the earth? I mean, surely if you even had a downpour for 40 days, maybe you get a couple of meters. But there's no way it's going to cover the whole earth. But this is what happened. The fountains of the deep burst forth. And so water from under the earth burst forth. And the fascinating thing is that quite recently they discovered that there are massive oceans underneath the Earth's crust, far bigger than any of our oceans that we have on the surface of the Earth. We don't know much what goes on in our Earth. We're only scratching the surface. But they discovered these massive caverns of water, which contain far more than the oceans. I don't know the ratio, but it's a massive amount. So these burst forth. And so very quickly you had this. Okay? Fountains of the deep burst forth. It must have been chaotic. Within hours, ark must have been buoyant. Guys must have been clambering, realizing that what Noah was doing for the last 120 years was real. And it must have been a horrific sight. It must have been terrible even for Noah to look down and see what was happening. He was just being obedient, and obviously the disobedience was being left behind. Now, if you take that onto a massive scale, this is what you have. The fountains of the deep bursting forth, not just where the ark was, but across the surface of the earth. So you can imagine very quickly that the whole earth was flooded. And it actually brings me to kind of a fascinating point, because often, old age earthers will say that you look at plate tectonics. Plate tectonics is the fact that our different continents are drifting apart ever so slowly. I think it's a couple of millimeters or centimeters a year they manage to measure, and there's definitely known plates in some places where the plates are being created, so material is being forced up and pushing out, and other places where it's coming together and going down. And so the continents are moving apart. And a fascinating theory, we don't know for a fact, but a fascinating theory is this, is that during the flood, we have something called rapid plate tectonics. So as the fountains of the earth burst forth, the continents were rapidly moving apart. And they say that this theory holds a lot of water, excuse the pun, but I don't know if you can see in that little graphic there. Can you see that India is actually tucked up against? That's why we've got so many Indians in Durban, because you can see that. No, we had a long time before us. Somebody left behind. Somebody left behind. They missed the boat. But you can see that India was actually attached to the bottom of Africa there. And it moved up and smacked into Asia. And they say the only way that they could form the Himalayas as a massive mountain range that they are, is if it had been moving at pace. If it was moving at about 2 centimeters a year, there's no ways there would have been enough force to force those mountains up. And everybody is in agreement that the top of the Himalayas were once at the bottom of the ocean, because there are fish fossils at the top there. And so even this seems to come together and give us evidence for a catastrophic global flood. Not just a minor little localized flood where it rained for 40 days, but something which was catastrophic. There's other evidence of a worldwide flood. I don't know if you guys recognize that. That's the Grand Canyon. And often the old age earthers will believe that the layers here were formed over time. So there was one little mini flood, and then one layer formed, and another flood, and another layer formed. But I won't go into all the scientific detail, but the Grand Canyon is rich with flood, what's the word I'm looking for? Evidence. And because the way the sediment was laid, it had to have been rapid. And the one thing, I read it quite a long time ago, I didn't have a chance to verify it when I was preparing for this presentation, but I read a while back that the Grand Canyon, so the Colorado River, which flows through the Grand Canyon, actually flows in the wrong direction if it had to be created over time. So if it started as just one little trickle and then slowly eroded down, as the long earth believers believe, it would have actually flown in the opposite direction, because the general lie of the land presents itself as such. So it literally only with the draining of a worldwide flood that it had caused the river to flow in that direction. So that alone gives us evidence that there was a worldwide flood. This as well gives us evidence. They found these mass graves of rapid burial, where animals have been buried. They've even found them in the middle of eating, so they've got like food in their mouth, and they were rapidly buried. And the reason why we have so many fossils is because it was buried all at once. If you think the animal normally dies, what happens to it?
Scary.
It gets eaten. There's nothing left. Creation's amazing because it actually consumes the whole thing, but there's no evidence that it actually ever existed. And the only reason why we find all these fossils is because they were buried so fast that nobody could eat them. Okay, so these were rapidly buried, and there's plenty of evidence of these mass graves. I quite like this one. These geological formations, they could have only been formed by running water. And we find them in places where there's no water, in deserts. And some people say, well, floods come and go, and they create, and then they recreate, but there's no ways that you're going to have a flood of this magnitude as a localized flood. And the thing is, if we believed that they were created and recreated, we would have seen the creation and recreation of those things within our own time frame. But the reality is that all of these guys are falling down. Like this one. I don't know if you know that one. That's God's finger. And the reason why those cars look a bit dated is because shortly after that, this thing fell over. Okay? 1988, God's finger was no more. Well, the rock version of it. But I didn't see another one pop up somewhere else to replace it. And so, if you believe in a long age of the earth, all of these things would have gone a long time ago, and there would be nothing to recreate it but a global flood. And so, all of this evidence speaks to a massive, massive flood. So if we carry on with our story, so it rained for 40 nights and for 40 days, and the very same day Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Noah's wife, and the 3 wives of the sons, they all entered the ark. I'm actually going to skip through quite a bit here, but it kind of revisits the fact that they all onto the ark and that it rained again. And then the waters prevailed, and they kept moving up, and we kind of covered that with all these graphics. And all the things on the earth were destroyed, all living creatures. Then we move on to chapter 8. Then God remembered Noah and every living thing, and all the animals that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters subsided. And the fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were also stopped. And the rain from heaven was restrained. And the waters receded continually from the earth. And the end of the 150 days, the waters decreased. And then the ark rested in the 7th month, 17th day of the month, on the mountains of Ararat. And the waters, so I'll stop at that point. And so the ark landed, hopefully not quite like that, because that would have been a bit tricky to get all the animals off. That's one depiction of the ark landing on Mount Ararat. This is the picture that we are familiar with. Maybe quite didn't look like that. That looks a bit too idyllic, I guess. Because you can imagine all the vegetation had to regrow, and not sure exactly how it all happened. God was in control. But there was God's promise, the rainbow, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. But the ark came to rest. An interesting story about the ark landing on Mount Ararat, just to put it into perspective. There it is here. It is kind of just on the right edge of Turkey. And there's been a lot of debate and conspiracy theories about whether they've found the ark on Mount Ararat. There's a picture that's been around for a while, and there's quite a few different angles of this, make it a little bit more realistic. They reckon that potentially could be the kind of fossilization of Noah's Ark. on Mount Ararat. It is about 6,000 years old. The guys, you can actually trek up into the mountains and go and see it. But some people believe it, some people don't. I remember I said to somebody once, I said, wouldn't it be so awesome if they really found like the genuine Noah's Ark, because it would just cement our faith. But then people would find another excuse, wouldn't they? But it is quite interesting that a lot of people point to that and say that there must have been a worldwide flood, because there's the evidence of the ark landing on Mount Ararat. What I find more fascinating, though, is not the physical evidence, potentially, that the ark landed on Mount Ararat. It's the fact that this biblical account that we've just read through doesn't only exist in the Bible. It actually exists across most of the cultures of the world. They actually call it the global flood myth. Okay? And there's this story in many, many cultures across the world that accounts or depicts a flood, sometimes of a global scale, usually sent by a deity or deities to destroy civilization as an act of divine retribution. Amazingly, there always seem to be 8 people that survived in some sort of boat to continue the human race. And you can find this story across most of the cultures of the world. I'm going to read one from China. It says, legends from ancient China describe a global catastrophic flood so vast that the waters reached the sun and covered the mountains, drowning all the land-dwelling creatures, including mankind, in the midst of this global calamity. There stood a legendary hero named Nuwa, spelled N-U-W-A with 2 little pinkies on the U, who turned back the flood and helped to repopulate the world. Analysis of the ancient Chinese bronzeware, oracle bone, and seal characters that are associated with the flood, and boats, led to the present-day discovery of evidence of Noah's Ark in the Chinese characters. So actually, you know how the Chinese, they draw symbols. And so a lot of the Chinese language has symbols which clearly represent the story of Noah's Ark. Noah's Ark housed, sounds weird saying Noah, but Noah's Ark housed 8 worshippers and the remnants of the world, and finally came to rest on a mountain. And the flood receded. The world began to be repopulated from the 8 people on the ark. Significantly, the Chinese account of the flood has been dated to 1000 BC, suggesting that the Chinese possess one of the oldest written records of this deluge. Interestingly, I don't know if you picked out on this one, it's going back one. I don't know how this culture survived, because that looks like 8 blokes in that boat. No, there's no woman there, which could be a problem. But anyway, there are many, many accounts. This is from Mesopotamia. I won't read their accounts, but here's a pictorial graphic of what their story entails. Then, other evidence that speaks of a worldwide flood is that there are cave drawings depicting 8 people in a boat, as well as, I found this one quite fascinating, in France, some of the oldest cave drawings there have pictures of animals which do not identify with that region. I'll just read the extract here. Some of the animals identified in these French caves include horses, cattle, reindeer, stags, panthers or cheetahs, bears, bison, owls, aurochs, whatever they might be, rhinos, mammoths or elephants, ibex, lions, wild oxen, and hyenas. Many of these animals are no longer common to France, which caused us to wonder what the animal world was like then. many animals today are separated into different regions of the world. If this Paleolithic ark preceded the flood, it may account for Noah's accessibility to gather animals for the ark. If it occurred after the flood, it may be a reflection of the slow dispersion of animal types. With either time placement, the cave paintings give extra validity to the biblical story of the flood. And so we continue with our story. It's not a story. It's a biblical account. And I know that there's some people who look at the same evidence we look at. I actually read an account today. I thought I was reading a biblical account of the Grand Canyon, but there are guys there refuting what the Six-Day Creationists believe, because they believe that there has to be some way of layering and then a break and layering and then a break. And so we're all looking at the same evidence and trying to fight our argument. But the beautiful thing is that there is so much evidence to back what we believe. And so this is how we can now, for those people who dispute that this creator being who created the universe, DNA, the human hand, can't just be a giant force out there. The Bible account of Noah's flood is just one example of how evidence points to a global flood, as well as this beautiful picture of Jesus being our Savior. How awesome is that? You can't refute it, can you? It's just beautiful. And then God promises further down, I won't read it just for the sake of time because we're heading towards 7 o'clock, but the promise of the rainbow, that He will never flood the world again. He'll never destroy humanity through a flood, but He will through fire. And it speaks beautifully as well of our Christian walk. We get baptized. We go into the waters of death, and we are raised through Christ. So just as Noah in his ark was a picture of salvation, who went through the waters of baptism, so do we. We get baptized in the Holy Spirit. We are baptized with fire. One day the world will be baptized with fire. Yet in our own experience, individually, we have that as well. And so the picture of the ark is such a beautiful illustration of our salvation. That is through one man, Jesus Christ. There's only one door. Scotch Island, maybe I'm missing out a few points here, but Grace reminded me earlier that the windows were designed to look up to God, not at the calamities down below, but to look up to God. And so there's so many little parts of the ark which are a visual illustration of our Christian walk. I'm going to attempt something a little bit different here now, and I can thank Pete for this. Because often, if we're going through our journey, and we can never persuade somebody with eloquent speech to believe, but what we can do is get them to start asking questions. And so just as we can now validate that what we believe in as a all-powerful God through His evidence, we can attribute or we can actually claim that what the Bible says is true of a biblical account of Noah's flood because there's evidence of it. The one question that often gets us is, how can you believe in a God of love when there is so much evil and death? And I want to give you this little illustration. I've heard it once before, and people posted something which reminded me of it. And I love it because it definitely helps us, even with our own walk, to get to grips with that. Because sometimes that question even bothers us. You know, we can maybe get that, yes, God is this amazing creator. We get that these are biblical accounts, not just biblical stories. But the suffering and the pain, how does God allow it? The analogy is this. You can ask that person, do they believe that there's hot and cold?
Yeah.
And people will say, yes, there is. In fact, cold does not exist. Cold is just the absence of heat. We experience cold when there's an absence of heat, so we can feel it. But it actually doesn't exist as a scientific entity, if I can call it that. It's only measured through the lack of heat. And that's why we actually get absolute zero. 0 degrees Kelvin, is it 473? Have I got it right? I think it's 473 degrees below Celsius. And we've got to those temperatures. You cannot get less than that because that's when there's absolute no heat. But heat, we've never been able to measure the hottest heat because we always find something that's hotter. I don't know how hot the sun is, but it's some ridiculously amount, 1,000 degrees centigrade. And there are stars and everything out there which probably burn hotter than the sun. So heat does not have a cap, but cold does. So I love this little picture here. So there's absolute zero. So cold does not exist. It's only the absence of heat. If you want to hit the lights there, Teresa. Does darkness exist?
No.
We experience dark. Why do we experience dark? Ooh, that's a bit big, isn't it?
Still no light.
Still no light. Yeah, I'm not going to try it again, but you guys get it. I'll just light another minute. So, as much as you try, you can have as much darkness as you want, but as soon as there's a tiny little bit of light, it dispels the darkness. And so, do you want to hit the lights again? Okay. So just as cold does not exist, it's just the absence of heat. Darkness does not exist, it's just the absence of light. Evil doesn't actually exist, it's just the absence of God. It's absence of goodness. And so when God first created the world, it was full of light. There was no darkness. Actually, if you look at the 6th day of creation, there was light before there was the sun and the moon.
Yeah.
Where did that light emanate from? Had to have been God. So God is light. And so if you've got 100% God and 100% light, what have you got? 100% goodness with no evil. But just as the account of creation, and Craig went through it with us last week, through one act of disobedience, God removed his hand from the world, and at the same time removed his light. And so now, with the absence of light, we now have darkness. And it's only when Jesus returns and restores the earth to its former glory will we have 100% goodness. So evil, because the trick question is that if God created everything as you perceive it to be, then how can he create evil if he is all love? He didn't create evil. He just removed himself, and as a result, evil flourished. And so evil, God didn't create, is just an absence of himself. But there is our hope, and it's Jesus Christ. And even though we live in this dark world and evil things will happen, we do have this hope that we carry around with us. And in this, even though Jesus is no longer with us, we can shine that hope in this dark world, and we can carry the hope of the Lord even though evil exists around us. And we can give people a glimpse of what goodness and what God really is. Until one day, He recreates the world and it's all good. And so I love that illustration because often we struggle with that. Why does evil exist when God is all loving? But it's not. We brought it upon ourselves. And we need to also then comprehend that we are born into sin. Because sin is just the absence of goodness. And so in the presence of the Lord, there's no sin. God removes himself. And we remove ourselves from God. That's when sin abounds. And so I enjoyed that illustration. So thank you, Pete, for posting that. His story was slightly different. It's in the context of a lecture theatre and a professor challenging a born-again believer. And he says this whole thing about, do you believe that cold exists? And goes down the story. Because he's trying to prove that God doesn't exist. Because why is there evil in the world? And so when we look at the creation account and we follow the story, it gives us hope. Because we know that God exists. There's evidence out there that God exists. And not just that. The biggest evidence that God exists is not the creation account, all the evidence we see in the world, all the things that I've covered during the course of this last hour and a bit. It's the evidence of a changed life. And so when somebody sees the light, when somebody sees the goodness of God and submits themselves to Him, that in itself is the biggest miracle of all. That we can encourage each other in the fact that all of these accounts, and we've just covered one tonight, has to be of God. The Bible has to be God's book, because there's no ways that a human being could figure all of this out and written it so many years ago. And so I just wanted to leave you with that as a little illustration and just a helpmeet for those people who challenge your faith. Because the Bible's clear, we need to be able to have an answer or give an answer for the hope in which we believe. And so when people challenge that, we've got these tools now which strengthen our faith and hopefully encourage others to have the same. Amen.